One day, usually without warning, it happens. You're doing something completely ordinary, sitting in traffic, washing dishes, lying awake at 3 in the morning for no clear reason, and a thought arrives that you can't unthink once it's there. You look back over the last however many years of your life. The choices, the compromises, the version of yourself you presented at work, at home, online, in every room you've ever walked into. And you realize, with a kind of quiet horror, that you cannot actually locate yourself anywhere in it. You can find the person your parents wanted. You can find the person your partner expects. You can find the person your job requires, and the person your friends have come to rely on. But you, the actual you, the one making choices from your own wants instead of everyone else's expectations, is strangely absent from most of the story. Carl Jung believed this exact moment, disorienting and painful as it feels, is not a breakdown. He believed it is one of the most important thresholds a person can cross in an entire lifetime, and that everything on the other side of it depends on what you do next. Before we go any further, if that description just describes something you've actually felt, hit like on this video right now and subscribe to the channel. I want you here for the rest of this because it only gets more honest from here. Jung spent decades studying what happens to people who reach midlife, or sometimes much earlier, and suddenly discover that the life they've built doesn't actually feel like theirs. He noticed a specific pattern showing up again and again in his patients. Successful people, admired people, people who by every external measure had done everything right, arriving in his office describing an emptiness they couldn't explain. They weren't in crisis because something had gone wrong. They were in crisis because something had gone too right, according to a definition of success they had never actually chosen for themselves. Jung came to believe that most people spend the first half of their life building an identity almost entirely out of external material. The expectations of parents, the approval of a culture, the requirements of a career, the roles handed to them by family and society, before they were old enough to question any of it. This isn't a personal failing. It's simply how survival works when you're young. A child cannot build an identity from scratch in a vacuum. They absorb what's around them, adapt to what earns love and avoid what earns punishment, and by the time they're old enough to actually choose, an entire structure is already standing, built mostly out of other people's blueprints. The problem isn't that this structure gets built. The problem is that most people never stop to check whether it actually matches who they are underneath it, because checking requires a kind of quiet, uncomfortable self-honesty that daily life rarely makes room for. You get busy. You get praised for performing the role well. The role starts paying real dividends, approval, stability, a sense of belonging, and it becomes genuinely difficult to tell the difference between a life you actually want and a life you've simply gotten very good at living. This is where the moment I described at the start of this video comes from. It isn't usually triggered by a single dramatic event. It's triggered by a slow accumulation of quiet observations, a persistent feeling of going through the motions, a sense that your own reactions to your life feel strangely muted, as if you're watching it happen to someone else rather than actually living it yourself. I want you to think about the specific shape this takes in your own life, because it rarely announces itself directly. It shows up as choosing a career path, because it was the responsible choice, the one that would make your family proud, rather than the one that ever actually pulled at something inside you. It shows up as staying in a relationship long after the honest parts of you knew it had run its course, because leaving would disappoint people, would look like failure, would require an explanation you weren't ready to give. It shows up as spending money on things meant to signal a certain kind of life to other people, rather than things that actually bring you any real satisfaction. None of these choices feel dramatic in the moment they're made. Each one seems small, reasonable, defensible on its own. It's only when you step back and look at the accumulated pattern across years that the shape becomes visible. A life quietly assembled, piece by piece, out of other people's approval, rather than your own honest wanting. Jung believed this happens because of something deeply human, not because certain people are weaker or more people-pleasing than others. He believed the need for belonging is one of the oldest, most fundamental drives a person has wired in long before conscious thought was even possible, because for most of human history exile from the group wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. This means the pull to live according to what earns approval isn't some shallow character flaw you should be ashamed of. It's an old survival instinct, doing exactly what it evolved to do, just badly matched to a world where you can actually survive without everyone's approval. Even though the fear itself hasn't caught up to that fact, understanding this doesn't undo the years already spent living this way, but it does something important. It removes the shame from the realization, replacing it with something closer to compassion for how completely reasonable it was to end up here, given how the mind is built. I want to talk about what Jung called the persona, because it's central to understanding exactly how this happens without you ever consciously choosing it. The persona is the mask, the socially presentable version of yourself built specifically to navigate the world, to be accepted, to avoid the pain of rejection. Everyone needs some version of this mask to function, to show up appropriately at work, with strangers, in situations that call for a bit of composure and restraint. The danger isn't that the mask exists. The danger is what happens when the mask becomes so permanent, so thoroughly practiced, that you lose track of where it ends and you begin. Jung believed that many people go their entire lives never actually distinguishing between the mask and the face underneath it, mistaking one for the other so completely that the question of who they'd be without the mask feels not just difficult but genuinely unanswerable. Here's something worth sitting with honestly. If you've spent years, maybe decades, shaping yourself around what earns approval, the moment you finally ask yourself what you actually want, independent of anyone else's expectations, can feel disturbingly blank, not because there's nothing there, but because that part of you has been quiet for so long it's out of practice, like a muscle that's gone unused for years and has to slowly relearn how to move. This blankness is often mistaken for evidence that there's nothing authentic underneath the performance at all, that the mask is all there ever was. Jung strongly disagreed with this conclusion. He believed the authentic self doesn't disappear just because it's been ignored. It goes quiet, waiting, the same way a voice grows fainter the less it's used, not because it's gone, but because it hasn't been given the room to speak in a very long time. I want to talk about the specific moment this realization tends to arrive, because it's worth understanding the pattern instead of assuming something has gone uniquely wrong in your particular life. It often arrives after a major external goal has finally been achieved. The promotion, the marriage, the house, the milestone you'd been building toward for years, precisely because achieving it removes the story that was previously explaining away the emptiness. As long as you're still working toward something, it's easy to attribute the hollow feeling to not being there yet, to assume satisfaction is simply one achievement away. But when you finally arrive, and the hollow feeling is somehow still there, sometimes louder than before, the explanation you'd been relying on collapses, and what's left underneath it is much harder to avoid looking at directly. This is why so many people describe this realization hitting hardest right after what should have been their happiest moments. Because success built on the wrong foundation doesn't feel like success once you're actually standing on top of it. I want to be honest about something here, because I don't want to romanticize this experience as some purely enlightening spiritual awakening. It is genuinely disorienting, and for a lot of people, genuinely painful, realizing that a significant portion of your adult life was built around other people's expectations can bring up real grief for the years spent, grief for choices that can't be unmade, grief for a version of yourself that might have existed if things had gone differently. Jung didn't believe this grief was something to rush past or explain away. He believed it needed to be genuinely felt, not bypassed with forced positivity or an immediate leap into fixing everything at once. Sitting with that grief honestly, rather than trying to skip straight to the redemptive lesson, is actually part of the process, not an obstacle to it. Now here's where this starts to become genuinely useful rather than just an accurate but painful diagnosis. Jung believed this realization, however uncomfortable, is not a sign that your life has gone wrong. It's a sign that you've reached the actual starting point of the work that matters most, what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a fully realized version of yourself, instead of a collection of roles inherited from everyone else. This process cannot begin until the gap between the performed self and the actual self becomes visible, which means the disorienting realization you're having isn't a detour from a well-lived life. It's the doorway into one. Everything up to this point was preparation, sometimes painful preparation, but preparation nonetheless, for the part of your life that actually gets to be yours. I want to talk about what it looks like to actually walk through that doorway, because understanding the problem without a path forward just leaves you stuck in the discomfort without any direction. The first step, and it's smaller and quieter than people expect, is simply noticing, in real time, the difference between choices that come from genuine want and choices that come from obligation or fear of disappointing someone. This sounds obvious, but most people have never actually practiced this distinction, because for years the two have been so tangled together that separating them feels almost impossible. Start small. Notice the next time you say yes to something. Pause, just briefly, and ask yourself honestly, am I doing this because I actually want to, or because saying no feels too uncomfortable to consider? You don't have to change your answer yet. You just have to start noticing which one it actually is, because noticing is the first step toward eventually having a real choice in the matter. Instead of running on autopilot toward whatever avoids friction most efficiently, I want to address something that might be worrying you as you listen to this, which is the fear that living more for yourself means becoming selfish, cold, someone who stops caring about the people they love. This is a common misunderstanding of what Jung was actually describing, and it's worth clearing up directly. The goal was never to stop caring about other people, or to abandon every responsibility you hold toward the people who depend on you. The goal is to make sure the caring, when it happens, is coming from an actual choice rather than a reflexive fear of disapproval. There's an enormous difference between showing up for someone because you genuinely want to, and showing up for them because you're terrified of what happens if you don't. The first is real connection. The second is a performance dressed up as connection, and the people receiving it can usually sense the difference, even if they can't articulate exactly what feels slightly hollow about it. Living more authentically doesn't make you less generous toward the people you love. It usually makes the generosity you do offer more real, because it's no longer being extracted by fear. Let's talk about what happens to your relationship specifically, because this is often the part people are most afraid of when they start doing this work, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. Some relationships in your life are built specifically around the performed version of you, the agreeable one, the one who never causes friction, the one who always says yes. When you start showing up as the more honest version of yourself, some of those relationships will feel the strain, and some of them may not survive it. This is a real cost, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But consider what that relationship actually was. If it could only be sustained by a version of you that wasn't real, it wasn't actually a relationship with you. It was a relationship with the mask, maintained by your willingness to keep performing it indefinitely. Losing that isn't a tragedy, even though it can genuinely hurt in the moment. It's the removal of something that was never quite what it appeared to be, making room for the relationships that can actually hold the honest version of you, the ones that were never going to require the performance in the first place. I want to talk about a specific and often overlooked piece of this process, which is grieving the identity you're leaving behind, even when you know intellectually that leaving it behind is the right thing to do. This might sound strange, grieving a version of yourself you didn't even choose, built largely out of other people's expectations. But that identity, however inauthentic, still gave you a sense of stability for years. It told you who to be, what to do, how to earn approval, and even if it was never quite right, it was familiar, and familiarity offers a kind of comfort even when what's familiar isn't actually good for you. Letting go of it means stepping into genuine uncertainty, at least for a while, and that uncertainty deserves to be acknowledged honestly rather than rushed through as if it shouldn't bother you. Jung believed this discomfort was not a sign you were doing something wrong. It was simply what it feels like to be between two versions of yourself. The old one you're outgrowing, and the new one that hasn't fully solidified yet. I want to talk about a particular kind of anger that often shows up somewhere in the middle of this process because it catches a lot of people off guard, and it deserves to be named instead of quietly pushed away out of guilt. As the realization deepens, it's common to feel a real, sometimes sharp anger toward the people or circumstances that shaped the performed version of you in the first place. A parent whose approval always felt conditional, an environment that only ever rewarded the version of you that stayed small and agreeable, a culture that sold you a very narrow definition of what a worthwhile life was supposed to look like. This anger can feel uncomfortable to admit, especially toward people you also love, and a lot of people rush to suppress it out of guilt, telling themselves they should just be grateful instead. Jung would say the anger deserves acknowledgement before it gets resolved, not instead of resolution, but as a real step on the way there. Anger that's honestly felt and examined tends to move through a person and eventually soften into something more like clear-eyed understanding. Anger that gets suppressed out of guilt tends to stay buried, quietly shaping behavior from underneath, the same way everything else that goes unexamined does. I also want to talk about the specific discomfort of disappointing people who genuinely meant well, because this is often harder to sit with than dealing with people who were clearly unfair to you. It's relatively easy to justify disappointing someone who treated you badly. It's much harder when the people whose expectations shaped you were, by their own understanding, only ever trying to help, trying to protect you, trying to give you a version of stability they themselves never had. Recognizing that their guidance still ended up constraining you doesn't require deciding they were bad people or that their intentions were malicious. Both things can be true at once, that someone loved you and meant well, and that the shape they pushed you toward wasn't actually the shape that fit who you are. Holding both of these truths at the same time, without needing to resolve them into a simple story of blame or total forgiveness, is part of the emotional maturity this whole process eventually asks of you. I want to give you something concrete here, because I don't want to leave this purely theoretical. One practical way to begin distinguishing your own wants from everyone else's expectations is to actually spend real time alone, without distraction, and simply ask yourself questions you've probably never sat with directly. What would I actually choose here if no one would ever find out? What have I been pretending to enjoy because it was easier than admitting I didn't? What decision have I been putting off because the honest answer would disappoint someone I care about? These questions are uncomfortable specifically because they've likely gone unasked for a very long time, and the discomfort itself is often a sign you're finally asking something real, rather than evidence you should stop asking. Write the answers down if you can. Seeing them outside your own head, in your own handwriting, has a way of making them harder to quietly dismiss the way an internal thought can be. I want to talk about something important regarding pace, because a lot of people, once they have this realization, want to fix their entire life overnight, quitting jobs, abruptly ending long relationships in a single dramatic conversation, making sweeping changes fueled by the intensity of the initial insight. This impulse is understandable, but it's usually not sustainable, and it often causes more damage than it needed to. Jung's individuation was never meant to be a single dramatic event. It's a slow, ongoing process, sometimes taking years, sometimes lasting the rest of a person's life, unfolding through small, repeated moments of honesty rather than one sweeping reinvention. You don't have to have the whole picture figured out today. You just have to start making slightly more honest choices than you were making yesterday, and let that honesty compound gradually the same way the years of performing compounded gradually in the other direction, without anyone quite noticing it happening in real time. I want to talk about the specific role a career or a long-held title plays in this process, because for a lot of people it's the single hardest piece to look at honestly. So much of adult identity gets built around a job title, a professional reputation, years of accumulated expertise in a field that may have been chosen more out of practicality or family expectation than genuine pull. Questioning whether this path was ever truly yours can feel almost dangerous, because so much has already been invested in it. Years of training, financial stability, a professional identity other people already recognize and rely on. Jung would say this is exactly the kind of question worth sitting with slowly, rather than avoiding out of fear of what the honest answer might cost. This doesn't necessarily mean the answer is to walk away from everything you've built. Sometimes the honest answer is that the work itself is fine, and what actually needs examining is why you've never let yourself enjoy it without needing it to prove something to someone else. Sometimes the honest answer really is that a change is overdue. Either way, the question deserves to be asked directly, rather than quietly avoided, because the stakes of answering it honestly feel too high to face. I want to talk about something Jung considered essential to this entire process, which is developing a relationship with your own inner life that doesn't depend on anyone else confirming it's valid. For most of your life, you've likely been checking your choices against external reactions. Did this earn approval? Did this avoid disappointment? Did this keep the peace? Individuation asks you to develop a different kind of internal reference point, one where you can actually trust your own read on a situation, your own sense of what feels true, without needing someone else's agreement to validate it. This is uncomfortable at first precisely because it's unfamiliar. You spent years outsourcing this function to other people, and building the internal version takes real practice, the same way any long unused skill takes time and repetition to rebuild. But this internal reference point, once it starts developing, becomes the actual foundation everything else in this process stands on. Without it, you're just replacing one set of external expectations with another, still looking outward for permission to be yourself, still fundamentally unchanged underneath a slightly different performance. I want to talk about one more thing before we get to the close, because it explains why this process, however solitary it might sound, actually depends on other people in an important way. Individuation was never meant to happen in a vacuum, purely through private reflection with no outside contact at all. Jung believed real growth also requires being seen and tested in relationship, having your emerging honesty meet another person's honest reaction, rather than staying entirely theoretical inside your own head. This means part of walking through this process involves finding at least one or two people you can actually practice this honesty with, people who can hear the more authentic version of you without flinching, without needing you to go back to performing for their comfort. These relationships become a kind of proving ground, a place where the self you're rebuilding gets to exist out loud instead of staying private and untested, which is often the difference between an insight that stays a nice idea and one that actually reshapes how you live. I want to leave you with something Jung believed about why this entire uncomfortable process is worth it, because the discomfort alone isn't a compelling enough reason to walk through it without understanding what's actually on the other side. He believed that a life built entirely around other people's expectations, however successful it appears from the outside, leaves a person fundamentally disconnected from their own experience, going through the motions of a life that technically belongs to them, but doesn't actually feel like theirs from the inside. And he believed that a life built even imperfectly, even slowly, around genuine self-honesty, produces something that no amount of external approval ever could: a sense of being genuinely present in your own life, making choices you can actually stand behind, building relationships that hold the real you instead of a carefully managed performance of you. This isn't a destination you arrive at once and never have to think about again. It's a practice you return to for the rest of your life, checking again and again whether the choice in front of you is coming from something real inside you, or from an old, deeply grooved habit of trying to keep everyone else comfortable. I also want to say something about the version of you that comes out the other side of this, because it's worth being honest about what actually changes and what doesn't. You don't emerge from this process as someone unrecognizable, some entirely new person who bears no resemblance to who you were before. Most of what made you specifically you, your sense of humor, the things you're drawn to, the way you love the people you love, stays intact, sometimes even sharpens. What actually changes is quieter and more structural than that. You stop needing quite so much external proof that you're allowed to be who you are. Decisions that used to require an exhausting internal negotiation start to feel simpler, not because the stakes got lower, but because you're no longer running every choice through the filter of everyone else's likely reaction first. The performance doesn't disappear completely, because some amount of it is genuinely useful for functioning in the world, but it stops being the whole of you. It becomes a tool you use on purpose, instead of a mask you forgot you were wearing. If you're sitting with this realization right now, if some part of this video describes something you've been quietly feeling for a while, without having the words for it, I want you to know that arriving here, however disorienting it feels, is not a sign that your life has gone wrong. It's a sign that some honest part of you finally got loud enough to be heard over everything you built to keep it quiet. That part of you isn't gone. It's just been waiting patiently for you to finally turn around and actually listen to it. You don't have to fix everything today. You just have to start listening, a little more honestly, one choice at a time, and let the rest of your life slowly become something that actually belongs to you. If this describes something you've been living through, do two things for me right now. Hit like, because it tells this channel to keep making things like this instead of the same shallow content everyone else is putting out. And subscribe, because I'm not finished with this conversation, not even close. I'll see you in the next one.